Renters' Right Act, it's just like a massive misstep by the government. Looks on the face of it like it's going to do rent control.
Government are increasing security of tenure for renters. This is about trying to stop people from being evicted by the back door through a massive rent rise. Rent controls do a couple of things. They redistribute from landlords to sitting tenants. There are these arguments about how they discourage supply. I think that can be offset through things like taxes on empty homes.
Landlords are going to be less likely to actually rent out property. The amount of housing that's going to be rented out is very, very likely to decline. It's going to be more expensive for those people to be able to rent. I just feel like it exacerbates that problem tenfold.
Hi everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Looking for Growth podcast with myself, James Newport, and Becca Ray. We're joined today with Shreya Nanda, who joins us as the co-chair of the YIMBY Labour Group and as a current councillor for Islington. She's previously been the chief economist and is now a senior fellow at the Social Market Foundation. Lovely to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we've got to dive into a bit of background for people who don't already know. Like, what was your journey into becoming what is now councillor and, importantly, co-chair of the YIMBY Group for Labour?
Yeah, of course. So I started out as a civil servant, as an economist, working in a bunch of different departments, including the Ministry of Housing. And that was really interesting. And that gave me a bit of a view into housing policy in this country and what's going wrong.
Was that after it became a ministry, or was that before? Yeah,
it was the first time. I was there when it was DCLG, and I was there when they changed the name to MHCLG,
okay,
so
cool.
like 2017-ish.
Yeah, the old Theresa May ministry.
And I was working on mechanisms to capture land value uplift, so reforms to Section 106 and SIL, which was interesting. And then I moved into then I worked at DFT on the sort of economic impacts of transport, which was also really interesting. And then I moved into the think tank world. So I worked at the Institute for Public Policy Research in the run up to the 2019 election and beyond. I worked on like a bunch of different policy areas, including tax policy. That was really fun, and I got experience of doing loads of different stuff. And then I moved to SMF as the chief economist, and then I suppose in terms of Labour YIMBY, we felt like, this doesn't exist, but we really think there should be a group in Labour pushing for building more homes because that's really necessary. And historically, the argument I think has come a bit more from people on the right, but now obviously there's this huge progressive movement behind it, which I think is really positive. So we're trying to bring people together in Labour around that goal.
So it's really cool that you had I remember when Theresa May, when I was in government, she made that change of the Ministry for Housing. It was a big part, right, was to make it into a ministry, kind of signalling effective. This is a really important agenda for us. So obviously you're in government, saw government trying to do stuff on housing, come out of civil service, go into the think tank space, and now the political space. What's kind of an interesting, I'd be interested in your view of how you see those different attitudes between those different groups in terms of housing. Do you see basically commonality that everyone is pretty much agreed what needs to happen in the area, and for some reason the system is failing to deliver? Or do you see actually there's a big difference between the views and the kind of incentives or the interests of those different entities?
That's a great question. And obviously in the civil service, I was working as an economist in a team of other analysts. So I think there was very much this view that we need to increase supply. That's got to be a big part of the solution. But I think elsewhere in the department, there's lots of people who have a planning background. And I think there can be sometimes less buying into the planning or the supply argument, or thinking that people are advocating for a silver bullet, maybe a bit less urgency. I don't know what it's like now. I'm obviously talking about several years ago. But yeah, I do feel in some parts of the debate there is still this kind of skepticism or lack of urgency on supply that I think can be frustrating. And that's really what we're trying to challenge in Labour YIMBY and be actually, we do need to increase supply. It is about redistribution. It's not just about redistribution.
Would you say it was quite hard then when you first created Labour YIMBY to get kind of other members of the Labour Party and the Labour parliamentary people on board with it? Were there people that were very susceptible to it? Do you think you've had to fight your corner a bit, especially in terms of the supply part of the argument?
Yeah, I think obviously in Labour and in the country, there's this generation of young people who are coming up now in politics and everywhere, who are becoming MPs, becoming councillors, becoming advisors, who have this first-hand personal experience of the housing crisis. particularly because so much politics is London-based and the housing market in London is so awful. So I think that really helps to get this all on the agenda. I think there are loads and loads of Labour activists who really get this and really care about it passionately. But it's about like taking that case out to everyone and being like, look, this is a progressive cause. Like, this is really important for redistributing wealth from those who already have it to those who are struggling with the cost of housing at the moment. Like, this is how we sort out the housing crisis and make it work for everyone, whether that's through like a mass program of council house building or whether that's through making it easier to build private housing. Like, we need to increase supply.
Was that redistribution of wealth hook, was that kind of the main way you've been getting people on board in the Labour Party, or are there other kind of ways or kind of things that you've used and arguments that you've used to get people on board who haven't been so pro building houses?
Well, I think there is a really clear, genuine progressive argument. Like, it's about living standards. It's about helping the most vulnerable people in society, like, you know, people who are struggling with homelessness or overcrowding or poor quality housing, but also, you know, young people who are living at home with their parents, struggling to get on the housing ladder. So it's like, for all of those groups of people, like, we do, like, increasing supply needs to be a big part of the answer, and the government needs to be radical on that.
Well, it's such a social mobility thing as well. Like, you cannot go and kind of build a life for yourself if you don't have the means to ever kind of get on the housing ladder.
Exactly, and there's such a disparity between people who can rely on that family wealth or inherited wealth and people who can't.
On that note, and I think this is something that our viewers would be very, very interested in and is very prescient at the moment. How would you like to see the Labour Party, or the things you would like to see the Labour Party do to meet its 1.5 million housing targets? Where do you think they're potentially doing well, but where do you think they could be going a lot harder and a lot faster on?
Yeah, of course. And obviously, like, you know, we in Labour YIMBY have been really pleased at everything the government's doing on housing. Like, they've put it at the centre of their mission for government, their mission for growth. I think that's fantastic. That's more than we were expecting, I think. And, you know, obviously all the stuff they've done on bringing back mandatory housing targets, building on the grey belt, you know, reforming the way we treat the environment and the planning system, that's all, I think, really positive. I think, obviously, there has been a slowdown in the market, particularly in London, and that's really worrying. And so we do want to see them go further in terms of policy. So maybe I can just talk about some areas where I'd personally like to see them.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So I think more ambition on housing targets is one. So I think if you look at the history of where the sort of housing delivery test and the targets have come from, I think originally it was sort of loosely based on like what's needed to kind of stabilise house prices and stop them from increasing anymore. And since then, the target has increased from, I think, 250,000 to 300,000. But like, to me, just stabilising house prices, like, we want to go further than that, right? Like, we want to make housing affordable again for young people. That's the aim. So, like, I would like to see it linked to actual outcomes. Like, we want it to be accessible for everyone to be able to afford somewhere that's like in a reasonable distance from their job or from their kid's school or from their family. You know, that's affordable, and that's what we should be aiming for in terms of housing supply. And that means particularly targeting areas of high housing demand, which I think the government gets. But yeah, that's so more ambition there, because I do think there's a bit of a, like, yeah, I would like to see us aiming a lot higher than where we're currently aiming in terms of numbers, particularly in, like, you know, London and other parts of the country where homes are really in high demand. Maybe another area I'd mention is, so from my perspective as a councillor, I would like to see the government doing more to reward councils that are doing the right thing. So I think obviously lots of councils are under immense financial strain and are thinking a lot about our budgets. And so if there's something the government can do to link housing delivery to like short-term finances and financial performance of councils, I think that would really get councils on board and thinking actively about what they can do to deliver more housing, rather than feeling like it's something that's being imposed on them. And at the moment, you know, I want to be making that pro-growth argument at the local level, but it's really difficult because we don't really see the positive fiscal impacts of more housing locally.
Yeah, I think this is like a really interesting angle. It'd be great as well as like your role as a councillor, because often the tension point you have, right, is local opposition to new housing, especially because they don't see these benefits, and I mean, more ambition from the government is always great, but my concern would be 300k is they would argue probably already quite ambitious, but also they're not even meeting it, right? The expectation is they will not reach the 1.5 million homes, and therefore they can increase the number, but actually the delivery mechanisms and there's supply, it's like supply of skills and things, etc. But yeah, how do you think it would change the local attitudes if you were to turn around and say, like, we can, if you reach this target we're giving you, if you achieve this by 2027, we'll throw you a lump. I mean, I come from Croydon and we're bankrupt again, I think. And I can imagine, like, actually one thing Croydon does have is a bunch of new developments going up. If they turn to them and say, like, okay, Croydon, you've got to achieve this, really high housing target, and if you do, we're just going to, like, wipe your debt. Yeah, it's 400 million or so they owe, but in government terms, that's relatively small, and for such a huge target for the government, Croydon could probably deliver like 20,000 extra homes or so. Do you see that as like being a tangible incentive for councils and councillors such as yourself, who's really pro this, to like win the argument? If you can go to constituents and say, well, look, we're doing this house building, and if we achieve it, that's actual more money for our area to upgrade, to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, we know that delivering more housing has these positive growth impacts and positive fiscal impacts nationally. So like, to me, that, there's clearly money there that's left over, that it would be perfectly possible to make sure that councils see some of that, because they're the ones making the decision. So at the end of the day, if you want like an incentive-based system, that has to involve councils, who are the decision makers. But just on your point about popularity, I would just also say, like, if you look at YouGov polling, 72% of Londoners want to see more housing. Like, it's really popular. It's particularly popular, with young people, with renters, with Labour voters. So somewhere like Islington, I think the trouble is when through the planning system, too often we just hear from a small minority of people who, are more likely to be older, wealthier, own their own home. And who are more likely to engage in the planning system. But it's about making sure we're not just listening to them, we're listening to the whole community. And particularly with things like estate renewal. So we have an estate renewal project in Islington that's currently going through the planning system. They've done ballots of the residents because it's delivering, like they're getting upgrades on their homes, like bigger flats or like better quality flats. And it's also delivering extra homes, including social housing. And that's really popular with local residents. So I think
fascinating. Yeah.
It's not always a case of like opposition from local residents.
So why? So this is very interesting because like the flip side is London actually is going down, right? And the government reduced the target of homes needed to be built in London, if I'm correct.
I would just say like we weren't meeting the target anyway. So
yeah, fair.
The aim is still to make delivery go up in London.
Yeah, but it's like, to me, it just seems like the stars are aligned. Maybe I'm just being ignorant here, but it feels like demand's there, people support it, people want to live in London, everyone knows London house prices are terrible. Why do you think there's this blocker? Like, why isn't this? It's a government priority, apparently. Like, what's the thing that's slowing it down?
Yeah, and I think it's something that has taken the government and the London mayoralty by surprise a bit, and it is really damaging. And I do think it's probably linked to a number of things, like the macroeconomic climate, big construction cost inflation, the interest rate rise. When we speak to developers, that's something they really talk about, because they're worried about if they have the unit and they can't sell it immediately, that suddenly is a huge increase in costs in a way that it wasn't before. And then obviously things like the new building safety, like the second staircase rule, the big backlog at the building safety regulator, which is a huge problem. So all of those things together, you're just like adding more and more things, coupled with like the big rush to buy before the stamp duty cliff edge ended. So that I think that's leading to like a temporary lull in demand now. So I think those are some of the reasons why.
So how do you break out of this? Like, it feels like the actual system's a bit broken there, like entirely.
And I guess how and why is it? Why do you think it's temporary?
Well, just that lull in demand because people were rushing to buy before the stamp duty.
Okay, so that specific part, not
that specific part,
factors,
I would say is temporary. Obviously, like we hope that interest rates will come back down, et cetera, but like who knows? Sorry, your question was?
No, just like I'm just interested.
What do we do about
how
it?
do you break out of this? Because like the Building Safety Act, that's new law. Like no one's going to repeal that, but that's a fundamental problem. You know, this idea on like the barriers to being able to sell quickly, etc., and arithmetic from developers. Like that screams to me a system which is now set up to directly disincentivize new build without law change.
Well, I think obviously they did their emergency planning announcement in London recently, and we hope that will help to shift things. I think there's obviously things they can do on the building safety side, like try and deal with the backlog, put more resources in, maybe look at some of the rules and ask whether they're actually delivering the most they can in terms of safety and housing, because I would question whether that's always true. But I do think there's also a case for like more counter-cyclical investment, like more of a role for the government to step in, like when there's this lull in the market delivering. I think what you're seeing, like, in a totally untethered market, like prices would be adjusting down and delivery would be going back up, but because everyone's leveraged, I think that's slowing things down. So I do think there's a case for the government to step in, and then that means you get that sort of consistent pipeline. You don't get these like troughs and peaks, and that means that builders can invest in more certainty and invest in things like modular and modern methods of construction, which rely on a stable pipeline.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated from because you've got your council side from Islington, and you've got your co-chair of Labour YIMBY, which is obviously focused on the national side. And like, how do you feel balancing those? Like, do you feel there's any tension between them? Do you see like the difference of like, you're on the coalface, you're on the ground dealing with councillor issues, which are often like, tricky, and often people asking you to do stuff which isn't really in your remit, versus then having to talk to the national level and being like, guys, you need to sort X. Like, how do you feel about balancing those? Do you like, is there a tension? Is there not a tension?
No, I mean, I think obviously as a councillor, like we hear from residents all the time, particularly residents in social housing who are like, look, like, can you help me move into a bigger property? The one I'm in is overcrowded or it's not suitable for my needs. Or like, maybe I want to downsize, I want to move out of Islington, but I can't because I'm in social housing. Like, the system is not set up for me to do that. So, like, the problem of people being in inadequate social housing is like a symptom of the fact that we're not building enough. The new social housing is all going to, people who are at the very sharpest end of the housing crisis, and there's people in desperate need who aren't getting it because there's not enough, because we're not building enough private housing, we're not building enough social housing. The more private housing we build, the more social housing we can afford to build. So like, they go hand in hand.
And the more private housing we build, the more the prices come down for it, right?
Exactly.
And people can get off social
housing.
Well,
the more of any kind of housing we build, the prices come down, right? Yeah. Because and like in Islington, we've always prioritised affordable housing. Like, we have a 50% affordable housing target, which is like very ambitious. So we're one of, I think, we probably have one of the highest targets out of London local authorities, or probably the country. And then, we're doing that because we know that social housing is really important to our residents. Like, lots of our residents are either in social housing or on the waiting list, and, are in desperate need of housing. But obviously, like, we need, the amount of social housing we're able to deliver under the current funding model is like barely scratching the surface of what's needed. Also the private housing delivery, I think we're doing a good job of meeting our housing targets, or we have been. Like, right now, obviously the market's doing really badly, but even so, like, you keep seeing this divergence where the social housing is going to people more and more desperately in need, and the private housing is going to people who have to be richer and richer to be able to afford it. There's this like missing middle. So that seems like a big problem, and that's evidence that we're not doing enough, I think.
And how do you, I find it always really fascinating of like the discussion around housing of like, have we got a right mix of housing? Is it just a supply issue and all of this? And it's like so strange to me that why would housing be any different from any other market, which is like supply and demand ultimately drives the price and the quality most of the time as well. Like, if you want more social housing, the great thing is just to have more supply. I mean, ideally, if you have more supply than demand, then people have a lot of choice over the quality of housing they want, and you naturally start pushing that up. Same reason, like, we don't have many terrible laptops. It's because people, laptops are relatively cheap, so you can get a good laptop. Bad laptops don't survive the market. Why doesn't this... One, tell me if you guys think I'm wrong. Like, maybe I'm completely misunderstanding the market entirely. But like, it seems like such a strange thing that we're still having this debate, and there's not like a large political consensus of people being like, absolutely we should have good social housing. And the way to deliver that is to create a reasonable abundance of housing that you push this quality up. why do you think that is something which can't cut through, or is it like, am I missing something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes from different directions. So I think one of the, like, obviously there's people on the left who will be like, oh, land isn't a good like any other good. It commands economic rent, right? So part of the role of the state is to make sure that rent is like redistributed rather than being captured by rentiers. And, people will talk about how developers and landlords will abuse their market power and like hoard land. And like, obviously I think there's truth to that analysis, but it is also true that if we build more housing will be more affordable and more accessible. Like those two, like I believe in both of those things.
Yeah.
And then I think some of the argument is motivated by people who are just, don't want more housing near them.
Yeah.
Standards.
Yeah. I didn't want that to be my cynical take, but I mean the idea of accumulation, etc. And I just think there's other solutions to that. The idea of like supply, just like any other market, you create abundance of supply, you have this kind of competition. Actually,
can I just add to that? Please. So I do think there's another thing, which is like the argument's not intuitive, right? Like people are like, oh well, but it's not like there's loads more people, so why do we need loads more houses? Or they're like, oh, it must be because of immigration. But I mean, the way I would see it is like, oh, it's also about like geographic, like where people are located and where the jobs are, and that's obviously shifted so much to like our major cities, and that's putting, that's why house prices and rents have gone up there so much, and we need to respond to that. But I think that's quite like a technical argument that people don't always get intuitively, and that's why it's difficult for people to grasp. Like, that's why we need to build so many more houses.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there are lots of empty villages and towns. Maybe a bit of high speed rail from those to where the jobs are. That's the.
I'd love that. I'd love to be able to live up north and commute down to London.
Hyperloop from like an old coal mining village in Wales. Hyperloop into your job in central London and Hyperloop home. Yeah, that's that. Yeah, that's very interesting. It's again like maybe a non-intuitive thing that people see, and also like there's an element of there's been a drain right of economic activity from a bunch of places outside of London. Some of that is natural, some of that is like forced, lost our manufacturing hubs, etc. So that's an interesting angle, but if we want,
and it links to all the regional inequality stuff, right? Because like Tom Forth and others are always saying that the reason that our second cities outside of London are doing so badly is because they don't have the transport investment and the density to benefit from those agglomeration productivity effects that like we do have in places like London. And if we invest in the transport and densify in the cities, like that's what we need to level up the economy, basically.
100%. Yeah.
So before diving into some policy things, I just want to kind of circle back and just hear a little bit about like what drove you to go into the civil service. That was like what led you to that crazy path? No, why did you go into the civil service? What led you to being a councillor as well? Like these are quite big things to put yourself up for. Like councillor is not always a thankless job.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I guess in terms of the civil service, I knew I was interested in policy. Like I studied economics. I wanted to try and have an impact on policy and help make better policy. And like I learned a lot. I got to see a bit about how economic analysis was done in government. So that was really interesting. But I think especially working under a Conservative government, I didn't always feel like I was having the impact that I wanted to be having. And that led me to like, go in a more political direction and go and join the think tank world. And then obviously being a think tanker, really great. But sometimes it can also feel like, oh, I'm writing all these reports, like no one's listening. So going and actually becoming a local politician and being able to affect some decisions at the local level feels really exciting when you're able to be like, oh, like I achieved that, or, like I influenced that policy. Like obviously I've only been doing it for a year, and there's still lots more I want to try and do, but that feels really great when it does happen.
And what's your hot take on the quality of civil service economic analysis when you were there? If I can ask a spicy question.
Yeah, I think one of my reflections was just that we spent a lot of time analyzing really small things, like because like you have to do an impact assessment whenever you do any policy. So I think when I was there was like a PDR that was going to affect like a really small number of houses because it was about converting like barns into houses.
Is that an economic impact assessment or just general?
Yeah, sorry, like the impact assessment where you look at the sort of economic, the cost benefit ratio and the cost and benefits of the policy, and you quantify it. And so I was like, I'm spending all this time looking at this policy, which is barely going to affect anyone. And then there are these measures, in the budget, like huge tax measures that affect the whole country. Like, we're not doing an impact assessment on those. Like, obviously, there's like loads of other analysis that goes on for those. So maybe that was like a bit of a naive view, but that seemed to me like a bit strange. And then we'd have
I've
like
heard some stuff. So
Or like, we're not going to publish this figure because it's embarrassing for us. Like, we're not going to pass that on to the minister because we don't want to. And it's like, why am I doing it then?
Yeah. And that's, is that kind of a reason you left? Like that frustration? Or was it more like you were excited about the think tank space and the freedom to...
I think I just wanted to do something a bit more political and a bit more directly trying to influence policy. And that's not really what the civil service is for.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, I was interested in people like, people who are interested, who are engaged. Obviously, like you've made a step into actually political life as a councillor, working with Labour, etc., in the YIMBY group, and people like that. Like, where you felt like you couldn't get the traction in government to make those changes, and sometimes it's like legitimately like we shouldn't be having civil servants who are making political decisions and things. Sometimes it can just be like, actually, I didn't have political views. I just wanted to get things done. I couldn't do it. Or like kind of like you're talking about small measures, spending a lot of time focusing on those, and then Treasury go and like change some massive tax, and then it's like completely outweighs the rest of it. Like the scales in government are so
it
strange.
felt a bit like you were often like there to do a tick box exercise because someone had been like, okay, we need some analysis of this to tick a box, so you have to go and do it, rather than, we actually want you to do analysis so that we can see what the best policy is to help inform our decision. It was like, we've already made the decision, or we're not going to make it based on the analysis, but we just want you to do the analysis to fulfill the process. So I was like, well, this doesn't feel very meaningful. I want to do something else.
No, very fair. Yeah, I talked to someone before who was like, policy-led evidence, right, rather than evidence-led policy. So one of the big things you wrote when you were at the Social Market Foundation was around social housing, and a couple of things you talked about in terms of like the importance of social housing on its support network for obviously often people who are in dire need of housing, and also just the impacts of getting it wrong, right? If you live in a mouldy house, the respiratory issues of that, health issues of that, how it's just like a general impact on your social economic opportunities and things. And you had a number of recommendations of like how to fix that. How do you feel that's gone? How do you feel it's landed? How do you feel it's helped shape government policy? Do you still agree with it? Obviously, it's been a little while since you released it. Are there any things you change about that? And then kind of wrapped into all of those questions all at once, obviously came with quite a big price tag. Do you think it's about 32 billion, I think, in total, if you add up all the measures over the whole lifetime? If you were like running the country or had the ear of Keir Starmer, would that be where you would say, yes, that's the best way you could spend 32, focus just on housing? Or do you think there's other things you would do? I'm trying to play the role of, if you're a politician, you're trying to weigh up these decisions. How would you kind of advise on that?
No, it's a great question. And I mean, I think there's a couple of things there. Obviously, the government announced their 39 billion on social and affordable housing, and I think that's great. We know that investing in affordable housing, it makes it easier, or it makes it more likely that people will support development near them because they feel like, it's affordable, it's accessible to people in the local community. So I do think when you're thinking about the economic impact, there is that, you can link it to those wider economic benefits that we know there are from delivering more housing. Then obviously, like more directly, if you invest in social housing, you're spending less on housing benefit, you're spending less on temporary accommodation. Temporary accommodation is a huge and rising cost for councils, particularly London councils. I think when we were writing that paper, we came across one argument that was like, we're spending a similar amount on supporting like low-income people with housing as we were in the mid-20th century, except then we were spending it on building new housing, like new social housing, and now we're spending it on housing benefit and temporary accommodation, which isn't getting us a return. Whereas like the council housing obviously gets you a long-term return. That's an asset that the state owns. So I do think it, like, investing in social housing is different from just like current spending. It's investing in an asset, and the changes that the government made to their fiscal rules, like allowing us to look at public sector net worth, made it easier for that kind of investment to take place without breaking the fiscal rules. So I do think there's scope for the government to increase investment there, and I think that would be a really good thing to see, particularly in a time like now when there's this big lull in construction that we need to address in the short term.
And where would you ideally get that kind of money to invest that money?
Well, I think because you're investing in an asset, it's not like, where you're increasing current spending where you have to like offset that through an increase in taxation. I think you can invest in it and then be like, the balance sheet balances out because we have that investment. Obviously, like you have to pay for the bricks and mortar and stuff, but like the land itself is not.
Yeah,
it's an asset.
Capital costs, right? Yeah, so it comes to liabilities and the interesting. Okay, I'm really interested in getting into like the renters. We discussed earlier before we filmed, was like
Renters' Rights Act.
Renters' Rights Act, yeah, because it's now been passed.
Yeah.
It's just like a massive misstep by the government. Like, what are your kind of views on this bill, which basically puts in, looks on the face of it like it's going to do rent control ultimately through a kind of back door? Do you think actually we've misjudged it? We obviously had on a LFG Make or Break. We had Sam Bowman, Sammy Hughes, and Ben Southwood talking about kind of this being a really terrible move. This is going to cause like real havoc. It's going to create rent. The market's going to be dictated by tribunal and all of this. And I think we're already seeing signs that like landlords are trying to pull out. I assume that's one metric which the government are quite happy to see. They want to see landlords releasing property and that becoming part of the supply. But have we misread this? Or what's your kind of view on as someone in Labour, as a London councillor? This is probably going to directly come around to you, right, with your own constituents who are renters.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, I think it's really good that the government are increasing security of tenure for renters. Like, obviously, the bill does lots of things, ending no-fault eviction. I think they're doing other stuff at the same time to increase protections against damp and mould. The bit on the soft rent controls, and obviously that links to the point about no-fault evictions, because partly this is about trying to stop people from being evicted by the back door through a massive rent rise. So I do think it's partly a necessary corollary to that policy. But yeah, on that aspect, I think rent controls do a couple of things. They redistribute from landlords to sitting tenants, and that's obviously I think that's a positive thing. It's like a redistribution of wealth. At the moment, I think the system is very unjust. Big transfers from tenants to landlords, unearned wealth. There are these arguments about how they discourage supply. I think that can be offset through, things like taxes on empty homes, other measures to discourage people from holding housing unoccupied. Obviously, there are trade-offs there and political difficulties, but I think to some extent, and also it can, if the government is increasing the supply of housing through other means, that kind of offsets that a bit. Thirdly, I think they negatively affect new tenants entering the market, right? Like particularly like poorer tenants, students, recent immigrants, because people are less likely to let go of an existing tenancy because as the rent diverges from the market rent over time, and that I do think is a problem. But fourthly, because they benefit sitting tenants, I think there's political benefits, right? They're popular, and if you want to win public support for your overall housing package, which includes supply side measures that sometimes are unpopular and won't pay off in terms of affordability for a couple of years, having something that delivers short-term benefits in terms of living standards to the majority of renters, you can see how that will help you deliver the overall package. So I do think there's a political argument as well.
So do you think it's a positive thing for someone who is wanting to move to London, potentially very, very talented, wants to, get a job, but would struggle at the moment anyway. Mm-hmm. But do you think this would be a positive thing for them?
So I think, also obviously this is about what they're doing is they're just saying rents can't rise above the market rent. So in theory, if they judge the market rent correctly, which I know is debatable, you won't see a divergence from the rent control rent and the market rent over time, which is what leads to this sort of disadvantage for new tenants, I think. So I think if rents diverge from the market rents, that will disadvantage people who are moving to London.
But I guess there's also the argument that landlords are going to be less likely to actually rent out property, because if they have a tenant that is not that great in the property, then they have to go through this whole tribunal, and you have a risk. If there's payments not on time, you also have a risk of not getting that money. So the amount of housing that's going to be rented out is like very, very likely to decline. So then you have a smaller pool, and it's going to be more expensive for those people to be able to rent. It seems like it would be great for a very few amount of people that are potentially in housing already in London. It's not going to incentivize them to kind of add anything more to the economy or because they know that they're stable and they're probably not going to be evicted and their rent's not going to go up. So when you have this you want new people to come to London and be able to kind of make their way and what have you, but it makes it entirely unaffordable for them. I mean, it's entirely unaffordable already, but I don't know, I just feel like it exacerbates that problem tenfold.
Well, I think in terms of landlords holding stuff off the market, the way to tackle that is through things like higher taxes on empty properties, right? Like, obviously that doesn't help if you're like living in under-occupying a home and that's your primary residence. Like, I agree, that is still a problem. And then, yeah, on the point, like, there are quite a lot of sitting tenants, and this will benefit them. It will make the market fairer for them. I agree. If the price charge diverges from the market price, it will hit newer entrants to the market. I do think there are pros and cons here. It's not just a negative. It's not just a story of negatives.
I guess like your last point about is like politically, it's a good thing, right? Like you can see the narrative there.
You have to deliver stuff that is going to help people in the short term in terms of their living standards.
Yeah, but is it a case that they're like the risk is that like if they were hitting their housing targets and showing actually meaningful changes to planning reform to actually deliver that, that's you could say okay, the overall package is at least somewhat. There's positivity there. We can show okay, they're doing this. Maybe it's a short term boom. Maybe they could even put a time limit on it or whatever. But like long term, you don't want to have a situation where your market is so messed up that you're forcefully creating rent controls that is restricting the market in this way. Like that shouldn't be the role of the government to like manipulate the market long term. It may be like a stopgap. Maybe that's political ambition. Would you agree with that, or would you say no? Actually, this is something which would be isn't just papering over the cracks of a structural problem. It is actually a like fundamental thing we should be having. Because I guess that would be my challenge of like in a normal functioning market, there just should be no means for this, and we should be sorting that underlying failure. Mm-hmm. And you're going to have scam landlords. They're going to be scam landlords after this as well. There's a bunch of rules already stopping people from like having poorly laid properties or poorly maintained properties, and they're just like ignoring it. And on the flip side, you're going to massively disincentivize. You're going to hit the good landlords because you're going to have this issue of like, I think it's within the first day or very early on from a tenancy, they can go to a tribunal and like argue about a rent. And this like mismatch of the system of saying like, I don't know, it's a difficult balance, right? Landlords, there's a negative connotation of landlords, quite rightly in a lot of places, of like there are really bad landlords and people who just don't look after their tenants at all. There's also like a substantial number of landlords who are actually very good and forming a key part of the market, which is like a completely healthy component of it. And do you think this like balances that well? Do you think this gets that balance right?
Yeah, well, I think there are lots of problems with the market at the moment. Like landlords, like if you're a tenant and you have a problem, there's very little recourse for you to get the landlord to address it in a timely way. And I think anything that can help with that is good. I think, yeah, the more we build, the less all of this matters, right? Like if we're increasing supply loads anyway, it matters less if there are other changes going on that are going the other way in the market. Yeah, I think in an ideal world, you have an abundant supply of housing and you have security of tenure for the majority of people. And yeah, like I would see them as kind of two separate things rather than like, we have to be succeeding on the supply in the short term to do renters' rights.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, so you want to protect the market. I guess I'm worried of like, is the fault with existing recourse is an interesting one. Of like, are there? I guess like, is there a failure there, or is there a failure of people knowing their rights, people having options for challenging this, for like taking their landlords to court for not fulfilling?
Well, I think we can say like, the failure to build increases the imbalance of power between the landlord and the tenant, and leads to worse outcomes for tenants. But like, I think it's also true, even in a market with very abundant housing, like there is an imbalance of power, right? Like in an ideal world, I think you would still want to redistribute power and money from landlords to tenants. Like, if you believe in the economic rent should be shared rather than hoarded by rentiers, which I do.
No, I find it like a really interesting element, right? Of like, what do you want the rental market to look like? What do you want its purpose to be? And you got the stability of housing. You also have the flip side of like, renting is really good for tenants' ability to move quickly. Like, it's one reason my parents rented for ages, because my mum was like, I love the ability to be able to move and whenever I want, to have a flexibility. It's not your house to maintain, so the landlord has to put in stuff to, if they're a good landlord, they'll maintain it, they'll do checks and boilers, electrics, all of this kind of stuff. You don't have to worry about it. That is kind of what you're paying for. And at the moment, the big cost often is just the price of it. And that comes back to a supply issue. So I appreciate like the big message is like, increase the supply, but I built more houses. And there's like a stopgap thing of like, how do we fix the market in the middle? In that middle period between actually hopefully delivering it, if that's what starts happening, versus like, what is like, how much do we bake in basically bad systems? I guess that's what I'm kind of interested in the housing market. It's such a kind of messed up market, messed up system now. There's lots of papering over the cracks. You see that with the Building Safety Act. I worked in building regulations, and it just saw this like crazy kind of reduction of your time spent on actual safety stuff and focused on, when I was there, it was like part R to do with, actually I can't remember what exactly it was, but it was like you start getting into these areas of like, electrics, energy efficiency, obviously one big part of it. There was stuff to do. Yeah, you basically live in this area where it becomes stop being the core message you're trying to get across of. And that's kind of what you get with the Building Safety Act. And it feels like you're getting a lot in this market of kind of papering over or change or just trying to fix things rather than dealing with the core issue. And what do you see as your role as the YIMBY group in Labour to be balancing that of saying like, okay, great, done the renters' right bill, but that should be a small component of actually the wider fix, which is supply.
Yeah, I mean, our focus is like supply and increasing supply and doing that in a way that's like in line with Labour values. So like increasing, of this supply of affordable housing at the same time and making sure the homes are of good quality and that we're taxing the land value uplift and it's not all going to, private landowners. Addressing regional inequality. So it's not that all the new homes are in parts of the country that are already doing well. But building lots more in London where homes are really desperately needed. So yeah, I mean, our focus is supply. It's not stuff like the Renters' Rights Bill, but I think that increasing security of tenure for tenants and redistributing from landlords to tenants is like probably a good thing.
And how much of the like Labour's success of the next election do you think, and do you feel as your own councillor position? Is it 5-year term as well? So
we're coming up next year.
Okay.
I came in a by-election.
Oh, okay, cool. So how much do you see as like that being a success and wider opportunities? So not just housing, but like opportunities in the job market, in Labour, etc. How much do you see that as like a vote winner or a vote loser for someone in your position?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was some interesting research out just the other day that showed that young people in London like want to see local politicians supporting more housing. Like they want to see YIMBY councillors, which obviously I think is great.
Do you think you've got more YIMBY councillors now in London that you've kind of recruited?
Absolutely,
Labour, obviously, yeah.
because so many people have personal experience because they're of the age where housing,
Yeah.
you know, they're renters or whatever. Housing is just a joke. Sorry, you were saying, does increasing living standards help with winning elections?
Yeah, just like how much do you see this as being like a big election winning topic from housing, obviously job opportunities, etc. How much do you feel the pressure on the doorstep for the people of going like, if we don't sort this out as a party, we are going to get destroyed in local elections, versus actually it doesn't matter because small votes, wider situations.
I mean, I'm a councillor in Islington. Like, it's, you know, Islington's more left wing than the rest of the country. Like, obviously, I hear from lots of tenants who are primarily concerned with like their individual social housing situation, and you know their family needs a big property or whatever. Lots of people. Cost of living is a huge issue for everyone, and like you know what's happening to benefits and taxes. Yeah, I mean lots of things get brought up on the doorstep, but I think nationally, like we have to be showing that we're delivering. Like I think there is this sense in the country, like you know, as Looking for Growth like talks about all the time, that like lots of stuff is broken, isn't working, like public services are broken. You know, the economy isn't delivering people, like housing is not affordable, and obviously that's Labour in a really difficult position because fixing that, you know, takes a lot of time and it isn't simple, and the public are like, why isn't this fixed? Like, sort it out now or we're gonna vote you out.
Yeah. And do you think the government's doing the right things in the area, or do you think there's like so fundamentally needs to like, do you think it's a time issue? I know we spoke before that you want to be more ambitious in targets, etc. Do you think fundamentally that the strategy is the right one, or that you'd like there to be a shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult. Like obviously, like I think delivering more housing is central to growth and to increasing living standards in terms of making housing more affordable. And I would like to see more ambition on that. Like I think some politicians in Labour like really get it and are really trying to lead on the issue, and there's lots of energy around it. But like, yeah, we need to make sure that we're taking the party with us and that there's like we're aiming for the right thing in terms of policy. And then yeah, in terms of other policy areas, like obviously there have been some U-turns where the government tried to do something and hadn't brought the rest of the party with them. So I do think it's about making sure that there's that, you know, like that argument is being made and everyone's on board and they understand that these changes are like leading to a better place, and like the decade of national renewal stuff that Keir keeps talking about. It's really important.
I know when like I was in civil service with local government as well. Like your views of politicians and how the system works, etc., is framed obviously by that context, and then you leave and you see it from the other side. You know, like, oh, yeah, and then you've gone a step further when you've gone into the actual political realm itself. Do you have more hope and faith of political systems and our governing mechanisms to deliver?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you actually turning around and being like, geez, there's a lot of things.
Yeah, and it's really difficult, isn't it? Because obviously, like Reform are leading in the polls. Like I think for everyone in Labour, that's like difficult, and it, you know, makes us be like, we need to do something about this. Like that's obviously not good. But yeah, I think the fact that like, you know, Labour are being like, we absolutely need to build like, or yeah, I think there's like a lot of good people are saying the right things about what the problems are and saying the right things about what we need to do to address it. I think that needs to like happen faster and with more urgency. And then I think with Whitehall specifically, like there is this issue that like the civil service is so big and has grown so much, and the number of special advisors is so small. And I think that's a real problem where the civil, like there's lots of inertia and like status quo bias in the civil service, and you do need to crack down a bit more to make sure that what's happening is like following your agenda.
Would that crackdown look like reducing the number of civil servants and then increasing the number of SPADs?
Not necessarily reducing the number of civil servants. I think that happened during the Conservative government were in power, and probably it led to a lot of like loss of institutional knowledge, and in some cases like damage to what the civil service is trying to do. But making sure that there's enough SPADs and that they're on top of what the department is doing. So I think at the moment ministers are just overwhelmed.
I think the institutional knowledge thing's really interesting because was it Joe that we were talking to about this? Kind of when you have a lot of civil servants tend to move around quite a lot. So I think that some people feel that there's a lack of knowledge actually built up. So like people look at, the kind of ideal of what the civil service is a kind of a very experienced person, 30 years into their career, blah, 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 kind of knows the ins and outs of everything. But in fact, what's kind of happened is you actually get a lot of civil servants that go department to department and what have you. And that institutional knowledge doesn't end up being that valuable in the end or not even there.
I think there's a trade-off though, because I think you're absolutely right. But on the other hand, like when you have people working in the same area for a long time, there can be a bit of like groupthink and like bias towards like, the sort of narratives and like received wisdom. And that sometimes it's good to have new people coming in. Sorry, there was something else I want to say, but I forgot.
It's really interesting to say you talk about like the SPAD thing. Because this does finally seem to be something which is like kind of permeating a lot of a realm of like it is absolutely insane. Like it is such a tiny percentage of the workforce as special advisors, and ministers are just completely exposed. And I feel really, I have lots of gripes with a bunch of ministers who I think, there's wider problems with it. But regardless, they are re-elected officials and they are completely exposed and drowning in the detail of what they have to be managing. And it's completely unrealistic to expect anyone, however competent they are, to truly succeed across the entire area which they are meant to be in charge of. And that just seems like why do we have these really arbitrary, random restrictions on civil service, like on special advisors, sorry. And that's what really struck me when Labour came in and they made some really interesting appointments with like Patrick Vallance. They were kind of tearing up some of the stuff of normal, just kind of giving your political mates the job who supported you and actually bringing in people they thought were good experts to have in those roles. But special advisors, which is a really weird thing, they just like restricted. And you're like, no, flood it. Like just flood it with good special advisors. Let your junior ministers have special advisor teams. Stop worrying about like them forming empires or just like actually have different systems in place to deal with that risk. Truthfully, you need teams to deliver. And instead they're so worried about the fact that like, this junior minister may start having 3 special advisors and then like plotting to overthrow me. What happens actually if that junior minister starts delivering? Like, oh my God, he might actually help your government. And it's like, has there been something, do you see that in the party changing at all? Because the only way I see this happening is from party members and people with influence such as yourself saying to them, come on guys, you can literally just sign it into existence. You don't need to do anything else. Just unleash your budget.
I mean, I think it is something I hear people talk about. I imagine some of the resistance is from like worries about how it will look or like not wanting to be seen to be spending lots more money on hiring more advisors. But I just wanted to make a related point about my experience as a counsellor, which is that like, it's much more reactive than I thought it would be initially. Like a lot more of it is just about being like, oh, like this, this case has come in, like we got to deal with this, like this thing, rather than being like, okay, like let's take a step back, like think about what do we actually do as a council, like where do we spend our money?
Like firefighting instead of like wider long-term planning.
I don't know if I call it firefighting, but just like, oh, this case has come in because this resident has emailed about this, or like, oh, we have to deal with this because it's come up, rather than like, what are we actually doing here? And like,
yeah.
Do you ever see that kind of role as a councillor changing? Do you think that there will kind of be a way of having councillors to look at the more long-term impact on communities rather than kind of case-by-case basis and when that comes in?
Well, I think partly it's like that's the role of like political leaders, right? And people talk about like, oh, like, this leader was like particularly good at like having a grip of the council as an organisation at this time, and like this leader isn't so good. So I think, there are ways to do it. But obviously, like when you're dealing with lots of difficult external things like big funding cuts, like that makes it harder to do that sort of taking a step back thing.
And you don't have any, like, obviously, I assume not, team around you or anything as a councillor? Like, what is your support network?
So I'm like a backbench councillor. If you're a member of like the council executive, you have like a PA, and you obviously have a team of officers in the department that you manage, like a minister.
Yep.
But we as backbench councillors have like support. There's like a support team, and they help us do our casework and like make sure it gets to the right part of the organisation. So that is a real help. But I think it varies council by council. That's how it works in Islington.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But I think that's interesting. Like, because one of the things dealing with a reactive situation, right, is your own capacity to, like, you've got those things to deal with. It's kind of like a mini special advisor role, right? But what you want from ministers is their ability to stand back and say, look, I have, instead of a chancellor having 4 or 5 SPADs, they have like 50. Then it's easier for them to say, look, you SPADs, you have my autonomy to make some decisions in this area on my behalf, because I'm going to step back and actually work out how we stop having 1,800 mental, insane taxes across the board, and actually we can have some kind of functioning tax system, and how we best spend £1.3 trillion a year.
Yeah, and drive the agenda rather than having it come from the civil service.
Yeah, exactly. Because it like the role is absorbed by the civil service, and the worst part of that is the civil service aren't meant to be political. So you have this void problem of like, the civil service, we can't do this because it's a political decision. So then it bottlenecks by the minister, who's like, I don't know what was going on. There's so many decisions, and instead you want them to have 50 special advisors who are like, I know what the expert thinks.
And when you talk to political advisors, they'll say like, oh, they'll say, oh, I went to the civil servant and I said like, look, this is the Prime Minister's priority. Like, can we please do this? And the civil servant was like, oh, well, that's not politically popular. So
interesting, yeah.
Which is crazy, right? Like, that's not their job.
Yeah, that's your job. That's completely insane.
Yeah.
That is. I mean, actually, that is that's a scandal.
Yeah.
Like, that should not be a role of civil service, like, at all. That's not their. Yeah, okay, that's.
But I do think it's internalised, because obviously civil servants do get into trouble when the government does something and then it ends up being unpopular, and then people go back and they're like, why didn't we stop that?
But they don't lose their job.
But like they
might get in trouble, but they still get a paycheck.
Like I think it still create, like, there is a lot of thinking about like, oh well, we can't show that to the minister because it's not politically feasible. Yeah, and it's like,
oh yeah. You have a lot of self-filtering. I remember that. We had you had a lot of that. We were like, oh, we can't put that up, despite it being, well, clearly this should be on the option sheet.
Yeah,
because
that's a political
decision. And I had lots of arguments about that when I was in civil service, being like, we should just put it on the advice, because it's for them to tell us it's a bad idea, not for me to pre-filter that. Special advisors really. I just find it really kind of comforting to hear people who are actually in the party positions of influence who take that similar view of, you need special advisors. What would your main, like, if you were sitting in a room with the cabinet, Tuesday morning I do it. Tuesday morning I bring you in. We're kind of struggling here, running out of ideas. Rachel Reeves is in the budget and she's a bit stressed. What are your kind of 2, maybe 3 key policies that you'd be like, deliver this if you want your premiership to like make a difference to the country?
I mean, we've talked about like housing, right, and like being more ambitious than the housing targets. And then in terms of the budget, like, I do think there's this, intergenerational angle. Like, I would say young people already struggling with the housing market. Like, if you don't own property, you're paying lots of rent to a landlord, or you're paying a large amount in a mortgage to buy a house. And then on top of that, you have a tax system which, under taxes property and wealth. Pensioners don't pay national insurance. Lots of spending that goes to people over the retirement age is non-means tested, whereas like lots of the benefits that go to, or the services that go to children and working age people, were cut to the bone over the last 14 years. Like, I would like to see some of that looked at in the budget, and I think the winter fuel payment was obviously an unsuccessful attempt to do that, and I think part of the problem with that was that they went, because they went right to the pension credit, or like whatever it was, threshold. They were targeting some people who like weren't very well off, but were just below the threshold, and you have to make sure that you're targeting the right group, which is like the wealthier group.
Yeah. Interesting. Becca, do you want to do, we'll bring it back, the old pessimistic, optimistic end.
Oh, yeah. So what do you think, where are you optimistic in the future of Britain and where are you pessimistic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's like a huge question. I mean, I think, like, as we've said, I'm heartened that, like, I think Labour are saying good things in lots of areas. Like, they get that housing is a big issue. You know, we need to increase growth. We need to sort out public services. And that means, you know, investment in some areas, but also, you know, the fiscal rules in the bond markets are a real constraint. So it's about managing all those things. We need to be investing. We need to be investing in like transport infrastructure and capital and stuff. So I think it's really heartening people get that. I think it's really heartening that, you know, all the stuff about the posting to policy pipeline, like people are like, you know, clever people who think about these things are having an outsized impact on the political debate. And I think that's a good thing. And there's obviously like lots of energy around.
I definitely agree with that part.
Yeah. Around like how can we fight decline, like sort out all these problems.
And pessimistic?
Oh, pessimistic. Yeah, I mean the next election is going to be difficult looking at the current polls. So yeah, that's what I'm pessimistic about.
Fair. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Great to get into like the detail of the housing stuff, and great to get your perspectives. Part of Labour YIMBY, I think, been very successful. Keir Starmer himself said he was a YIMBY, so that's got to be chalked up as a win. And yeah, congratulations on winning the election last year, and good luck for May.
For May, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me. It was great to come on.